Welcome to Raven Conversations, the show where we bring you news and information on the Washington National Guard, as well as in-depth conversations with the people who make it all happen. You. I'm Jason Kreis. The beauty that surrounds us in the Pacific Northwest is nothing short of awe-inspiring. The year-round green of the dense forests, the majestic stature of the Cascades, the full breadth of the flora and fauna, and the cooling waters of the Puget Sound are all no doubt wonders to behold. But the stunning scenery and bountiful outdoor activities come with a powerful and shocking price. For millions of years, Mother Nature has forged our landscape with mighty earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, living in the majestic Pacific Northwest, most of us, hopefully all of us, are well aware of the natural disaster threats that we live with. There are the towering volcanoes that dot the Cascades, the most famous one being the one that killed 57 people when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. There are the numerous earthquakes that happen on a daily basis, and there are the deadly landslides like the one that took out the small community of Oso in 2014. And then there's the famous Cascadia subduction zone fault line that lies off our coast. It is capable of unleashing unspeakable amounts of damage to our coastal communities, as well as massive destruction to our infrastructure. Bridges could collapse, cutting off major roadways. Airport runways may sustain damage, rendering them useless. Communities could very well be isolated from all types of connection and communication. It could very well isolate people for up to 2 weeks or more. For the next 2 episodes of Raven Conversations, Sarah Morris and I will talk with experts who will lay out exactly what we face as far as natural disasters here in Washington, what they are, what you can expect when they happen, but most importantly, how you can prepare for them. We've invited Maximilian Dixon onto the show to explain to us what exactly we face here in the Pacific Northwest. He is the Hazards and Outreach Program Supervisor at the Emergency Management Division. He also manages the earthquake, tsunami, and volcano programs in Washington. So that means he has vast amounts of knowledge about a significant event that could happen in our lifetime. And in the next episode, we will talk with Brigadier General Jeremy Horn about how to put together your very own preparedness kit and where to put them. Studies have shown that in the event of a major disaster like the ones we face here, the ones that survive are the ones who prepared. As guardsmen, we need to know what threats are out there. After all, we are the ones who will answer the call to help assist our neighbors and the first responders, who will most likely be overwhelmed. But we need to prepare ourselves, our families, and our loved ones first. We hope that the next 2 episodes will give you the knowledge and the motivation to start preparing yourselves for at least 2 weeks. For many people, it just may be that long before the cavalry arrives. So, without further delay, I give you our conversation with Maximilian Dixon. I'm here with Maximilian Dixon. He is the Earthquake Program Manager? Or?
Actually, my title has changed. Okay. So I'm now the Hazards and Outreach Program Supervisor.
Okay.
But I manage the earthquake, tsunami, and volcano programs for the state of Washington.
Tell me a little bit about your education. You know, what you studied and...
So I have a bachelor's in environmental science, studying climate change and ecosystems. I have a master's in urban planning, sort of a traditional planning degree for city planning. And then I also have a master's degree in infrastructure planning and emergency management. So covering, what happens to infrastructure systems during disasters, how they operate, and then also to how to plan for big disasters.
Okay, cool.
Makes sense. And then with your job, can you just sort of explain what your job is here in the emergency management? I mean, your title says a lot, but what does that mean?
So I manage the earthquake, tsunami, and volcano programs for the state, but I also oversee preparedness and outreach for the state of Washington as well. And essentially it's bringing science to practice and getting all of the key players together to help educate, inform, motivate, and protect the public for natural hazards.
Okay. So living here in Washington and on the West Coast, what kind of threats and hazards do we have to be on the lookout for?
We have a lot of hazards here on the coast. As you can see, lots of mountains. So we are on what we call the Ring of Fire. It's the Pacific Ocean. All the way around the Pacific Ocean, there's a lot of activity. So essentially, you've got tectonic plates that make up the whole surface of the planet. Think of puzzle pieces floating on a really hot ball of kind of a liquid hot rock, right? And so these puzzle pieces are, either moving away from each other, like under the Pacific Ocean, or they're sliding across each other, like the San Andreas Fault, or they're subducting underneath each other, which is what's happening here off the coast of Washington. So our biggest hazard that we have here for natural hazards is the Cascadia Subduction Zone fault. And that runs about 700 miles long. It's about 80 or 100 miles off the coast of Washington. It goes from northern Vancouver Island all the way down to northern California. And this fault is capable of producing potentially up to a 9.2 magnitude earthquake. So think the 1964 Alaska earthquake, except longer. And it can shake up to 5 to 6 minutes. So if you go back to Nisqually, earthquake 2001, that was our last sort of small, big earthquake. I say small, big earthquake because it was pretty small for a big one. And that earthquake lasted about 30 seconds. And you could see the damage, about $1 to $4 billion worth of damage. And now imagine shaking was a little more intense for 5 to 6 minutes,
Right.
not 30 seconds. That's a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the last event that happened from the Cascadia Subduction Zone that we know of was 1700. It was January 26, 1700. And we know that because there are records of an orphan tsunami in Japan, because they have records back 1,000 years, because they have a lot of tsunamis throughout their history. And so the fishermen, took these records and they said, in 1700 we had no earthquake, but we had this tsunami that hit us, right? And then we also know from Brian Atwater from the United States Geological Survey and others who did a lot of work digging along the coast, and they found sand deposits over going back, 1,000 years or so to different tsunamis that have happened on the West Coast. So it very clearly shows that there were multiple tsunamis, and there have been quite a few, I think something like 20 different events in the last 10,000 years for the West Coast. And also there are ghost forests of trees. What happens is when you have a subduction zone earthquake, which is the Cascadia Subduction Zone, that means we've got the North America plate, which is quite large, and it's moving sort of west-northwest. And then you've got the Juan de Fuca plate, and that is going underneath the North America plate. And essentially it's heavier, it's underneath the ocean, and it's being dragged down. And right now we know that the North America plate and the Juan de Fuca plate are locked. So they're moving towards each other, but it's just that pressure that's building up. And so eventually that pressure will get so great, it'll overcome the friction and it'll slide suddenly, similar to the Japan Tohoku 2011 earthquake that devastated Japan. And so we will see something like that here in Washington, Oregon, and California, and British Columbia. And so the last event was, 319 years ago. And these events happen about every 200 to 600 years. So we're in the window of having an event. We do know that it's locked, so that pressure is building up. And so it could happen any day. Now that's the big driving force here. That's the big one that everybody talks about. And this Cascadia Subduction Zone earthquake, it is capable of generating very large tsunamis. And I mentioned that there was that orphan tsunami in Japan in 1700. Well, it also hit our coast, and we can see that there were quite large deposits. Now, that wasn't the largest event. So we've had larger events in the past that, the wave heights have been higher. So the modeling that we do right now is for a 2,500-year event. That Cascadia Subduction Zone event from 1700 was about a 500-year event. And so the 2,500-year event, which we know is possible, it's happened in our history. It is capable of developing or producing 60-foot waves that will hit the Washington coast within about 15 or 20 minutes. So you have the rupture of the earthquake, and it's like a zipper, right? So you have 700-mile-long fault that is going north-south along, underneath the Pacific Ocean along the West Coast. and it will break at some point. It'll start somewhere on that 700 miles. And so kind of our worst case scenario is if that breaks and starts in Northern California and then starts breaking like a zipper. So what'll happen is it'll overcome the friction and it'll slide really quickly, and then it'll be like a chain reaction all the way up. Yeah, and so like a zipper unzipping, right? So it takes minutes, a few minutes for this fault to fully rupture. By the time it hits us, all these energy waves and the tsunami waves are going to be sort of focused our way. And so once that starts, you can expect waves to hit Westport, Ocean Shores, not necessarily Neah Bay, but on the outside, the northern tip, Long Beach, 15 to 20 minutes. Wow. And so you've got 5 to 6 minutes of shaking, and then 10 to 15 minutes after that, your first wave arrives. Now, what happens then is during the shaking, you have what we call subsidence. And subsidence is because all this pressure with the two plates that are locked, the Juan de Fuca plate's pushing on the North America plate, and it's hard to explain over, audio, but essentially it's lifting the coast up out of the water, that pressure. Right. So once that pressure lets go, the coast will drop about 6 feet, just like that. Wow. Yeah, and so you're going to have some water that's going to rush in along the coast immediately. You're going to have all that shaking, and then, like I said, 15 to 20 minutes, first wave arrives, and it's just going to devastate the coast. Yeah, and you're going to have a series of waves because a tsunami in the open ocean travels about 500 miles an hour. Right. It's the entire ocean coming towards you, the entire ocean. Right. And so it's not like surface waves for the tides and things like that. It's talking the entire ocean, absolutely powerful. You think about the waves that are coming in that are hitting the coast is just an endless series of locomotive trains coming, wave after wave, because they come about every hour. There's multiple waves for 12 to 24 hours. And think of it as just like one train lined up against the other ones all the way up along the coast for the whole western coast of United States. And they're all moving at the same time, and they do not stop. And so that's what you're getting hit with. That's the power of the ocean. So as an example, 1 foot to 2 foot tsunami can slam cars and trucks up against buildings and do massive damage. That's just 1 to 2 feet high. It's extremely powerful. And so now imagine a 60-foot wave. Right. Yeah. So it won't be 60 feet everywhere, obviously, just in some places. But it's hard to model. We can't tell exactly where that's going to be because each event is different. But essentially, yeah, you have 5 to 6 minutes of shaking, multiple series of waves coming in. So you've got buildings that are damaged, you've got infrastructure that's damaged, roads, you've got landslides, that are been because of the shaking. You've got all this loose soil coming down. You've got trees falling over, telephone poles falling over. You've got overpasses collapsing. You have buildings that, the sides of buildings are coming down. You've got everything inside the buildings that are falling down on top of people. I mean, you just have all kinds of destruction that's happening. And then you get hit by these waves, and it just washes everything away.
Wow, that's scary. That's...
Yeah. So I guess in that model of the really big one, the 2,500-year event, I mean, the Pacific coast, so we're talking the actual Pacific coast out on the Olympic Peninsula, as far as Washington's worst hit by the tsunami?
Correct.
Does that have any impact on the Olympic Mountains, since they're sort of like a solitude?
So the Olympic Mountains are...
it's super weird.
Yeah, so they weren't created by magma coming up from below the earth. They were just heavy, dense rock that got squeezed up, kind of like a pimple, over time, over millions and millions of years. Yeah. And so they are not volcanic. Right. And yeah, so they're just really hard rock. But, as far as impacting the Cascades, the Olympic Mountains, I mean, there might be some rockfall.
Do those glaciers sort of give way that are at the top?
Oh, I see. So for avalanches and things like that. It's a possibility. It really depends on what time of year it is. It depends on the conditions, how much loose ice or snow is up there. Right. But yeah, there could be some ice or snow giving way. I wouldn't say there aren't large enough glaciers there, and especially if it's during the summertime, there's no glaciers. Right. So let's say middle of winter, it just had a little bit of a sort of a warm rain, So some things are kind of loose. Yeah, potentially you could have some rock slides, you could have some avalanches, some landslides situation. Yeah, so if you're climbing, certainly, yeah, that would be something to watch out for. But the biggest impacts are going to be landslides that are human-made. So you have a road that cut into a hillside, right? You have a development that is, cleared brush and trees from a hillside, or, anything that where we have altered the landscape because it hasn't had time to have an earthquake or to settle over time per se, hundreds or thousands of years. So you've got this soil that could go because the base has been taken away. Yeah, so those kind of things. Also liquefaction. So the Christchurch 2010, 2011 earthquakes, a lot of liquefaction. That's essentially where you've got water in either under or within loose soil. And the shaking, like if you're standing on the beach, right? And you're right next to the water and the sand is wet and you're kind of moving up and down with your feet and then you start to sink. So that's like liquefaction. So imagine shaking your feet really fast and you're sinking down. So essentially the water comes up and whatever is heavy sinks. So buildings or cars or things like that. And so those essentially, it can damage buildings and stuff, but it's not something that's going to like suck you in like quicksand or anything. Yeah.
Have we been able to pinpoint, maybe not pinpoint, but identify areas up and down the coast that will be hit the hardest in like a 9.0 event?
Yeah, the coast.
Just the coast?
The coast is going to be hit the hardest. So they're closest. Okay, so if you're thinking about earthquake, shaking, right? So think about it like a light bulb. So you have a 100-watt light bulb. The closer you are to that light bulb, looking straight at it, the more blinding it is, the brighter it is, right? The further away from that light bulb, the more dim it is, right? The less intense. So it's just like an earthquake. So it releases energy, it shakes. The closer you are to that earthquake, the more intense it is, the more shaking it is, right? The intense the shaking. The further away you are, the less intense. So since the fault is just off the coast of Washington or right underneath the coast, the folks that are closest to it along the coast are going to feel the most intense shaking. And consequently, they are going to get hit the hardest with the tsunami waves. And that's going to hit them sooner than anyone else. So it's really the folks on the coast that are going to get hit the most. But the waves will travel into the Salish Sea and Puget Sound. So especially for maritime, boats, ports, harbors, ferries, things of that nature, anything that's on the water or right next to the water, it's going to get hit. And so you're going to have powerful currents. So even if the wave's only 3 to 6 feet high, or the power of that ocean and those currents are going to be really, really strong. So it's going to damage, everything that's on the water or in the water or next to the water. And so it's going to have a huge impact on our economy. And it could set us back 10 years. It's going to shake the entire state. So any buildings that are unreinforced masonry buildings, like brick buildings or concrete buildings that haven't been reinforced with steel, those are prone. Also buildings that, if you look at like apartment buildings that are, 3, 4, 5 stories, and they've got these little metal poles that are the first floor where you can drive underneath the building, like these little apartment buildings, those are very vulnerable as well. We call soft story. So those buildings are definitely vulnerable and potentially could collapse, or at least the sides of them. And then of course you've got overpasses and bridges and pipes. Oh man, fuel pipes, water pipes, sewer pipes. You've got electrical poles. You name it. There's going to be all kinds of damage. So that's why we are really, really focusing on the public and everyone else getting prepared, because you're going to have to be on your own for a while. So we do recommend at least 2 weeks. Now, if you're on the coast, it could be more like a month. So it really depends on you, because a lot of coastal communities are going to be isolated. You've got one road in, one road out. Right. You have bridges. You've got landslide issues. They're going to be stuck for a long time, and so it's going to be a tough situation. And think about when you're on the coast, let's say it's the middle of winter,
Right.
or even the fall, 40 degrees and raining, right? We don't want people to, survive the tsunami by knowing their evacuation routes, drop covering, hold on, protecting themselves during the earthquake so that they don't break a leg or hit their head, so they can actually get to high ground. So they run their evacuation route, they get to high ground, and then they don't have anything with them. They don't have a jacket, they don't have anything to protect themselves, and then they die of hypothermia in 40-degree raining weather because they're out there in the elements for days and days and weeks.
Right.
So we want people to be safe. And
Yeah, it's not just the actual impact or the event itself, it's the follow-on that could really get people.
Exactly. Yeah. Now that's just the big earthquake, right? So that is driving, those tectonic plates running into each other, that is driving also the other earthquakes and faults that we have here in Washington. So essentially what's happening is Washington is getting crushed and twisted because of all that force, right? And so since the state of Washington is made up of different types of rock, and some are soft, some are hard, and you've got cracks that form. And so these faults are surface faults, and they are also very dangerous. And so the last Seattle, because we have Seattle Fault, Tacoma Fault, South Whidbey Island Fault, Devil's Mountain. So we've got quite a few what we call crustal or surface faults. It's because they're very close to the surface of the Earth. And like I said, when I was describing before how close you are to that light bulb, since they are very close to the surface of the Earth, you are going to feel really intense shaking because you're that much closer, right? So we're talking about a few miles to maybe 10 miles underneath the surface, and so you're very, very close to it. And so the Shadowfall Earthquake, to give you an example, went off in 900 AD, so it's about 1,100 years ago. And when that went off, it sent alki, if anyone's from Seattle, they know alki, 25 feet up in the air. And Bremerton, Bainbridge Island. So essentially you're thinking about a crack in the earth, and part of the earth went boop, raised 25 feet, just like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that whole area of alki that you drive on and people have built condos and whatnot, that was all underwater. Oh yeah. Wow. Yeah, and you can see it too. If you look at the LiDAR, the images and stuff, you can see where that fault is. Yeah, so very, very powerful earthquakes. And actually for Seattle or Tacoma, some of the cities and areas and towns next to Puget Sound, these crustal faults are actually going to be a lot more intense. You're going to have a lot more damage from the shaking because they're right next to the surface or right next to them. So these are very, very powerful. Now, luckily, doesn't happen very often. There's about a 5 to 15% chance in the next 50 years that we're going to have a crustal fault somewhere. Yeah, and then we also have, so you got the subduction zone fault, it's the big one. Right. You've got the crustal faults, which is essentially cracking at the surface, right? Because there's so much pressure going on, eventually part of that rock has to release, and then it shifts, right, suddenly. And then you've got what we call deep fault earthquakes. And deep fault earthquakes happen, 30, 60, 100 miles below the surface. And so that was the Nisqually earthquake. So that was about, I think, 34 miles below the surface that earthquake happened. And since they're so far away, so much further down below the surface, we don't feel them as much. And so they're not as damaging, luckily. So with that Nisqually earthquake, it went off, and it was a wide area, but it wasn't as intense shaking, and it didn't last as long, the earthquake. Because the longer the fault is, then the longer the shaking is, essentially, and then, of course, the more energy is released. But that deep fault earthquake, we have those about every 30 to 50 years. So there's an 84% chance in the next 50 years that we will have another one. And so we had, 2001, 1965, 1949. I mean, if you keep going back, it's pretty consistent. Unfortunately, people do die from these earthquakes as well. But they happen a lot more frequently. They're not quite as damaging, but they can kill people, and they can do a lot of damage. But essentially what that is you've got that plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, that's going down, hundreds of miles below the surface. Right. But as it gets pushed down, it's saturated with the water from the sea, right, from the Pacific Ocean. It's in the soil itself, right? So that soil and that water and everything gets down and it starts getting hot. Because the further down you go below the surface, the hotter it gets, right? And so that rock starts melting, gets like taffy. And because of that, it doesn't take as much pressure. There's not as much friction. You know, it's like, you know, to hold on to it. So it slips. Yeah, it's like lubricated, right? It slips a lot more often. That's why we have them about every 30 to 50 years. And so that's slipping. But so that's good, but on the bad side, it's adding more pressure up above where the big earthquake is, right? Big fault is. So it keeps slipping down. And then, of course, with that, you've got that seawater and, you know, the melting of the rock, and that's creating gas and pressure that is then comes up and is helping to form our volcanoes, our wonderful mountains that we have here, the Cascades. And so we have 5 active volcanoes here. And that's the reason why, because we're on the ring of fire, and it's constantly melting. And that seawater and stuff that's bubbling up and it's coming through the surface. And so you've got that pressure, and so Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, right? Killed 57 people, unfortunately. And then we've got 5 active volcanoes here in Washington State. So can you name the 5?
Rainier, Adams, Baker, Helens, Glacier.
Perfect.
Nice.
All 5. Awesome.
I love the mountains. Those are my.
And you're the most recent transplant.
I am, but I'm obsessed with the mountains. I mean,
Yeah.
I know they're dangerous, but man, are they pretty.
They are. They draw a lot of people here. And so we have the 2nd highest and the 3rd highest risk volcanoes in the country. Right. So Mount St. Helens is number 2, Mount Rainier is number 3. And Kilauea in Hawaii is number 1, because, I mean, you see what happened last year. It erupted for like 5 or 6 months, right? Yeah.
But it's been a while since Rainier's erupted.
1850 something?
Yeah, something around there. I
think it's 1853 maybe.
So it's like worst case scenario, like the earthquake happens and then Rainier blows up and, and then everything's destroyed all at one time.
Well, a lot of people ask that, and there really isn't science that links large earthquakes triggering volcanic eruptions.
Okay.
We're not saying that it's
not even like an aftershock hitting it or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors that go into when or how volcanoes erupt and what triggers it.
It's just, it feels like it.
Yeah, I mean, it's, well, a certain amount of gas and stuff has to build up, and there's a lot, certain conditions that need to be met, but there isn't really science linking to say, okay, an earthquake happened and now we have an eruption, right? It's not saying they couldn't happen together, but it doesn't necessarily causation, cause and effect. Yeah.
But that would be like the doomsday scenario.
Well, that would be really bad. That would be really, really bad. But yeah, Mount Rainier is extremely dangerous. You've got so many people that are living either next to or around the mountain. You've got lahars, which are essentially just big mud flows that come down from the mountain. They're like
those are
tsunamis.
going to like the most populated areas.
Yeah, you've
based off the model, right?
Yeah, you've got the city of Ording. They do evacuation drills every year, which is great because they have about an hour of warning, potential warning until they get hit by a lahar potentially. You've got, we've seen it in the past that lahars have come all the way down to Tacoma.
Yeah, down to the tide flats, right?
Yeah. So, it's certainly a possibility. It's a dangerous mountain. It is beautiful.
Yeah, I will. So my daughter does the junior ranger program at every state park, and they show in the video they show the projected different routes of the lahars.
Yeah.
And they were very excited to learn that where we live was not like super in danger because they were very aware that the volcano is dangerous. But it showed that one of the possible routes take it all the way through the Nisqually River too, so even south of Tacoma, which is crazy.
Yeah, there are a few, and it depends on the conditions.
Right.
That's what they said. So we don't really know when the next lahar is going to happen, or which valley it's going to go into. And if you look at Mount Baker, and you've got all the skiers up there, and hopefully we get enough notice to get people evacuated. But also, I mean, with no eruption at all, Mount Rainier has claimed a lot of lives for people just climbing. Yeah. And hiking.
Well, and that's what then when you summit too, there's some places where you can sort of, because of the volcano, you can sort of like just dip into the wrong spot if you're not careful. And
Yeah, I don't know.
I guess
so on
the integrity of the glacier on top isn't like 100%.
No,
Right.
yeah, especially with our atmospheres heating up, you've got melting of the glaciers, and the ice is not as hard as it used to be.
Right.
Melting and refreezing, melting and refreezing. Exactly. And you've got avalanche. That's always claims lives quite frequently, not just on Mount Rainier, but other mountains. And so they are dangerous. And people get lost hiking. So unfortunately, you want to know your get up on your wilderness outdoor training and your climbing and all that. But yeah, so we have a beautiful landscape. We've got volcanic risk where you've got potentially for a volcanic eruption. You've got lahars. You've got ash that can go all over the state that can cause all kinds of economic impacts, health hazards of breathing in. And they actually have 4 inches of wet ash can collapse roofs.
Wow.
Yeah, so it gets real heavy. Yeah, it doesn't take much.
No, that's crazy.
Yeah, so good to know about that. Also, you can, depending on the type of rock and the type of volcanic eruption, you can have big boulders that get sent out. And there's, volcanoes are very interesting. But it's all comes back to that ring of fire, right. And that's what's kind of the main driver for our hazards here. Now, of course, we've got floods, happen every year. It's the most frequent natural disaster in the United States is flooding. Yeah. And then, of course, wildfires. Right. The hotter it gets, drier it gets during the summers. We have a lot of high wildfire risk. And, you've got kind of your hypothermia and, there's a lot of things that can do you in.
It's the price we pay for the beautiful landscape.
Yeah.
But if you get prepared,
then you'll be all right.
If you know what you're doing, get the training.
So what's out there that people can do to be prepared? So
there's kind of 4 main categories of how I kind of go through preparedness, and essentially is get informed. So listening to this podcast, finding out, well, what are the hazards and the risks that you face.
That's totally true. We talk a lot about preparedness on this podcast, so they should totally listen.
Perfect. Well, they're starting out. That's great. And also looking at the mil.wa.gov/preparedness website, and FEMA, ready.gov website, American Red Cross, and of course their local emergency management website. There's a lot of great detailed information on the specific hazards and risks that are for the community. So definitely checking those out, reaching out to emergency managers. So getting informed is key for creating a family emergency plan is really essential. And that's just how are you going to respond and prepare for an event.
You might be at work, your kid might be at school, and
right.
You guys are split up. How are you guys going to get back together?
Right, what's your reunification plan? Yeah. Do you know if you're at work or school or out shopping, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? What happens if the overpasses have collapsed and the telephone poles are down and you can't drive anywhere, right? Is there a shelter nearby? How are you going to communicate? Do you have out-of-area contact? Just getting that family emergency plan and kind of walking through the different scenarios, most likely scenarios, and how you're going to, take care of yourselves and reunite and make sure you're going to survive through it. And then you want to build kits. And I always tell people start out with your vehicle kit if you have a vehicle, because it's most likely going to be with you or nearby, right. Whether you're at work or home or shopping. Having one in your car is extremely important. And then building from there, because again, when you're getting prepared, it's a lifelong journey. It's one step at a time. Don't burn yourself out. Just do a little at a time. Plan it out, and then having a go bag is extremely important, especially if you're on the coast, because that may be the only thing you can grab before you have to get to high ground, and you want to make sure you've got the key things in there that's going to help you survive. And then getting connected. So essentially, getting signed up for alerts. Whether that be hopefully earthquake early warning when it comes hopefully to the public in the next year or two. Getting signed up for your local alerts if for a city or county. And getting signed up for ENS, which is your earthquake notification system through USGS, or for tsunami alerting through NOAA, National Weather Service. Whatever alerts you can, and then getting connected with your neighbors, getting CERT training. community emergency response training, getting whatever other training that is available, and talking to your friends and family and your neighbors, and just participating in exercises such as the Great Washington Shakeout, which is the largest earthquake drill in the world. It's the third Thursday of every October. We also have a big tsunami component as well. So if you're on the coast, we want you to practice your evacuation and walking your routes, of course. But essentially, yeah, so it's get informed, make a family emergency plan, build a kit or two, and get connected. And those are kind of the key things. And it takes time, and don't be intimidated, just a little bit at a time.
So what do you do to be prepared? What have you done? Like, you did every single one of those things that you just described?
Yes.
You have?
Yes.
So you have a kit at work, you got a kit in your car?
Yeah, actually, I have a sleeping bag at work. I have extra clothes. I have hygiene. I've got food. I've got water. I have actually like 4 preparedness kits.
We have a plethora of water and
I see
soda.
that. Water is important. 3 days without water, you're in trouble. I have a couple car kits. I've got a kit for my wife at her work. Actually, it's larger than just for her because she works for a small company, like 10 people, and so I just added some extra stuff for them. I also have extensive supply of food and water and everything at home in different places. So in my garage, in multiple rooms, just in case you can't access a certain part of the house.
Wow.
Yeah, and I have a 1-year-old son, and so I've had to change my preparedness stuff to incorporate what he needs. And I also changed my family emergency plan because number 1 is to reunite him with mom. So I've got a few babysitters that help us out and family. So I updated our family emergency plan, went through all that because we live in Seattle. And there are hubs in Seattle, and essentially they're sort of communication information centers. And so I have mapped all those out to where the most common places that we're going to be. Not myself, but my family and friends. And so they know where their closest hubs are.
Because you're like, I'll be here.
Well, I'll either, if I'm at work, I will be here at Camp Murray for a very long time. If I happen to be in Seattle, if I'm south of the canal, I'm going to go to the Seattle Emergency Operations Center. Now, I already have pre-planned with them, so I'm not springing myself on them. And then if I'm north of the canal in Seattle, then I'm going to go to the Regional Response Coordination Center in Bothell, FEMA Region 10.
So is this something that everybody can plan to go to those places, or is it?
No. So you need to, if you're an emergency manager, and
it's tied simply because of what you do.
Yes, because of what I do. I have certain roles and responsibilities, but I am responding to the event, to whatever local emergency operations center that I can. And we have Washington EMD, Washington State Emergency Management Division. We have looked at where we live and work and everything, and kind of pre-planned, because most of us are not going to be able to get here, let's say if it happens in the middle of the night. Because, just from Seattle to Camp Murray, there are, I think, 14 overpasses that potentially could collapse. So it's going to be next to impossible. And this is something to consider. If you work at JBLM or you work at Camp Murray, how are you going to get here?
I could run.
You could run. Okay. You're going to have to look at
That's going to be
not
my
taking
family
the freeway
plan too. I won't. I don't have to. I could go completely through the base.
Perfect. Well, a lot of people may not necessarily have that or not know their alternative routes, right? So being prepared and knowing your alternative ways of getting to work, getting to the base, and also if you don't have a family plan with your family, then what often happens is people don't report to work because they want to make sure their family's safe or they're not prepared themselves.
Right. I would also run to my child. That's probably the plan.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, so reunification with your children, knowing what the schools, if your children are in school, what is their emergency plan? Right. Do they test it? Do they practice?
So my daughter is in the Steilacoom district, and they do practice several different emergencies. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
So at least
one
one school system. No. Well, they tell us that they did it.
Okay. So what I'm trying to do, hopefully over the next number of years, is to encourage schools to practice with parents.
Right.
Because what we don't want is parents panicking and coming to the school when they don't need to, especially if they're in the tsunami zone. Right? We want them to go into high ground. Also, if they have no idea what the emergency plan is, their kid doesn't have their out-of-area contact in their backpack or their phone, and they don't know what the protocol is, then there's going to be all kinds of chaos potentially. So practicing with the parents, and then also helping to inform the parents that, hey, did you know you have earthquake risk? Did you know you have a tsunami risk? So making sure that the parents are informed and practicing.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it was nice that she did it, though. I mean, it's different for me since I work here and I actually get informed. But yeah, I could definitely see how that would be a better way to do it.
Yeah, it's important, and having everyone involved.
Just practicing with like maybe an alert message and then seeing how that goes.
Right. So I just want to run through real quick what people should expect during the shaking.
Yes.
And just some tips, recommendations during and then right after. So let's say the earthquake happens next month, right? Wherever in Washington State. And earthquake early warning is not available yet, right? So you're not going to get seconds to minutes of warning, right? It's just going to happen. So you start feeling shaking, you figure out what it is. Sometimes it takes a little bit because it doesn't happen very often, right? So was that a big truck? What was that, right? So as soon as you realize, whoa, it's shaking, this is an earthquake, hopefully you drop, cover, and hold on under something that will protect you, because the most likely injuries are going to happen from something either falling on you within a building or you falling down when you're trying to move.
Right.
So you want to make sure you're protecting your head and your neck, you're getting underneath something solid, or if you're outside, you're getting away from anything that can fall on you and get down to the ground, protect yourself. There's also kinds of tips you can look at for when you're driving, looking around you, slowing down, alerting everyone that you're slowing down, pull over somewhere safe so you don't have a telephone pole landing on your car or an overpass, putting on your emergency brake, covering your head and neck and ride it out, right? So there's key things that you can do. So let's say you ride out the earthquake, you've protected yourself, shaking stops. So immediately what you want to do is you want to check yourself for injuries because your heart's probably going to be pounding, it's going to be a stressful situation. So check yourself thoroughly for injuries, right? Because you don't want to bleed out, right? So then once you've done that, you want to assess your environment. Is there broken glass? Is a fire started? Do you smell gas?
Right.
Are people screaming? Does it sound like your building is cracking still? So you want to assess your environment real quick to see, okay, do I need to get away from where I am to somewhere safe? And if you don't, smell smoke or see fire or, gas or, you seem like, okay, I think I'm okay, then you're going to want to look around and check for other people. Are they injured? Does anyone need help? Let's say you're at work, right? So hopefully you have an emergency plan at work where you go down through a checklist of people, and you've got facility managers who are kind of checking the building to make sure everything's okay. But essentially, checking if anybody else needs help, injuries, and then follow whatever your evacuation or whatever your emergency plan is. And then you want to try to obviously contact folks through your out-of-area contact. Using a text message is a lot more likely to get through. But figuring out and following your plan, based on the conditions that have happened. So essentially, those are the key things. Now, if you're at home and you know how to turn off the gas, and you feel like the earthquake was damaging enough that you might have to turn off your gas, then go ahead and do so. Also the water as well. And if you're at home as well, one of the best things to do for water is to shut off the water that's coming in from the street and to drain that clean water that's still in your pipes into the bathtub that is at the lowest level, whether that be in the basement or ground floor. So you want to drain all that clean water into that bathtub so you have that able to use. So that's one of the first things that I would do after you turn off the gas and the water if you need to.
Right.
And then just kind of assessing your structure. Is it safe to be in there? And just gathering yourself and following your plan.
This is so informative.
Yeah, and very scary. I think I want to move now.
Yeah, right? I don't know.
No.
I still want to look at the mountains.
Yeah.
Even though they're dangerous.
So I stole this from Steve Eberlein but essentially one of his preparedness talks is he says, well, imagine, so a lot of us we moved here or we live here, we like to go camping, right, in the mountains.
Right.
Now, an earthquake or a major disaster is like when camping comes to you.
Yep.
And you didn't plan for it.
That's one way to look at
That
it.
is
Yeah.
one way to look at it. Luckily,
Interesting.
there's many different pieces of camping gear in my garage.
Yes, I have all my camping gear next to a lot of my preparedness stuff, and I use the camping and hiking and to cycle stuff out. So.
My husband and I both have 10 plus years of military gear in our garage.
Yep.
So, plenty of gear to choose from.
Perfect. Assuming you can get into your garage.
Assuming we can get into
Yeah,
our
'cause
garage.
Doors, and especially garage doors, tend to get jammed.
Just gonna Hulk
So having a crowbar somewhere,
it. Smart.
would be a good move.
Thank you.
Thank you for scaring the pants off of us
Yeah.
and making us rethink how we are going to be
So
preparing from here on out.
what we've seen over and over again for disasters around the world is that the people who get prepared are the ones that survive.
Right.
Over and over again.
All right. Well, you heard it from the man himself. Get
Yep.
prepared.
Get prepared. Doomsday style.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.